I,
Look,
yes,
look
we
at
are
that.
on. I can, so you're going to start with a statement, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Mary.
I could start with a statement, but I was really thinking about phrasing it as a question.
Oh, okay.
So this screen that's up there right now, which is our new graphic, for Christmas, we had the first one that just had the Christmas tree, right? Christmas at Hendersonville, and then Journey Life continuing. And this one says lessons from New Testament people of faith, which is what we're planning on doing in 2025. But the question is Mary a New Testament person of faith or an Old Testament person of faith or both? I would say both, right? When does the New Testament actually start? About after or with Jesus, right? And so this occurrence that happens here at the very beginning of Luke, I think is kind of like, maybe if you want to get nitpicky, it's the winding down of the Old Testament through a person who's alive, who's obviously of childbearing age before AD time starts, and yet we call her a New Testament character, but she really kind of walks from the Old Testament into the New Testament.
Yeah, or you might say she walks from the intertestamental period to it. Her name was Miriam. Oh, that's the Hebrew part. It was really Maria. That's the Greek and Latin. Mary is the English. All those are connected together. So, so who was this? Notice the New Testament, you don't have any Miriam because they're always translated Mary. You don't have any Marias in the English Bible. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if in the Latin Bible, the Vulgate, it said Maria there. But she is a very interesting person. She doesn't appear that many times in Scripture. She appears at the birth narrative, of course. Then you see her at the wedding at Cana, where people think that that Jesus is kind of rude to her, but he wasn't really being rude to her. She says, they have no wife. She is kind of pressing him to do it a certain way. And he said, no, but that's not the way to do it. So he does it his way. He wasn't ready to reveal himself to the world at that time. And then, of course, we see her at the cross, and she's there with, and we may get in more of this later on, but maybe not today, but she's there with, actually, there are 3 women beside her that are mentioned, and one of them, if you look very closely, is her sister. And if you check it very carefully, and that sister is the mother of James and John. So she is James and John's aunt. She's going to go home and live with John. At the cross, Jesus will look down at her and John and behold your mother. Take her home with you. And then she appears lastly in the book of Acts, chapter 1, when Jesus ascends. There she is, and she's there with the brothers of Jesus. So who are these brothers? Well, there are 2 big views. There's the Roman Catholic view that she was a perpetual burden, therefore the children are they came with Joseph. Joseph's been married before, but there's no such indication. The indication is that she is the mother. Our interpretation is that she is the mother. Mm-hmm. And of course, out of those children, the girls are not mentioned, but brothers and sisters are mentioned. But one of the brothers named James is going to become extremely important in the book of James. He is going to be a key person in the early church. He is, we have his, archaeologically speaking, we have his bone box, and it says on the bone box, in Aramaic, it says this is Jacob or James. James is the New Testament form of Jacob, one of the New Testament forms of Jacob. James the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus, Jesus, or a short name for Joshua. And so most scholars now have come to the view, or many, many scholars, that that is the bone box of Jesus' brother for many, many reasons. So she has a lot of roles to play, and she knows a lot of people. She's one of the supporters of Jesus. There are a group of women in Luke who travel occasionally with Jesus, support him, and Mary is one of those people.
I was going to say, I read an article by a scholar who was saying that everything you just said, Mary mentioned by name or Mary bodily present somewhere, like at the cross or at Cana at the wedding. And then all of the inferences of Mary. Even Paul, when he's addressing to the Corinthians, this Jesus, is the one that was born of the virgin and went through the whole thing. Even though her name's not mentioned, she's still in other places in Scripture because she's the mother of our Lord, right, even if she's not called out by name. And I thought, wow, if you take all those, then she goes into all kinds of other places in the New Testament too.
Right. She is the relative of Elizabeth, the wife of Zacharias. Therefore, she's related to John the Baptist. So Jesus is related to John the Baptist. So an incredible number of tentacles go out, touching the different places that she's involved.
Mm-hmm. So this morning of the 5 Sundays, even though remember we won't have class on the 22nd because we're all going to be eating pancakes. So we have four classes, 5 sermons. This one this morning was the favored one, was the theme of the idea to discuss. And so I went and did a little research on favor, especially in the Old Testament, and found that it's very closely intertwined with grace. And it shows up in places like Psalm 90 and Genesis 41 and 2 Samuel 20, where it's talking about favor, the favorable way, the way of good, the way of grace, good, goodwill, beauty, peace, etc. Gracious, kindness, sounds a whole lot like we're getting attributes of Hesed in here. Yeah. Pity sometimes, but in this text that we're looking at today, that wouldn't be the case. Esteem, success, etc. So it comes from charis or charitu, right? Which is what we get charity from, which is what we translate into love, right?
Yeah, King James uses charity instead of love for agape.
Right. So I found it fascinating that this favor, this idea of the favored one, it's packed with more meaning than just, oh, hey, this happens to be the person that Gabriel first bumped into of all the people that were accessible or in a position in life where they could have been the mother of Jesus. I don't think that's the case. I think this was a individual that Yahweh had known when he sent Gabriel, who he was sending him to and why.
Yeah, she, as John Michael you talked about, being an ordinary person, and in the sense he was trying to stress that. In another sense, she was a person of extremely high character. God did not pick out people with low character. Sometimes he utilized people with low character, like Goliath sometimes. People like that. He utilized them, and even some kings who weren't what they really ought to be. But John Michael talked about her humility, and lots of character. Stan has talked about how she was favored by God. But one thing to always keep in mind that God used a lot of people with high character.
Yeah. Well, let's do this. Let's look at this, and I think this will kind of expand what you're saying too. The term often in the Old Testament refers to finding favor in the sight of God, to raise the countenance or raise one's head, which we sing the song, you're the lifter of my head. Something that's encouraging, something that is the gaze of God on you, that type of thing. So I would say that maybe where we can kind of bring those two thoughts together is the world has expectations of who is extraordinary, right? And the measures by which the world says this person is extraordinary or this person is ordinary is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is actually that God knew that when Mary was asked this, she wouldn't run away and say, no thanks, this is not for me, I don't want to do it, or I don't, you've got to, like John Micah mentioned, Zechariah had to have proof, and he ended up losing his voice and unable to speak until John was born. We don't see any of those things with Mary. So she's not ordinary from just any woman who could have been at that time a parent for the Messiah would have worked, and she just happened to be the one. She's not extraordinary by the world's terms because she didn't have a resume of, well, here's the princess of, Sepphoris, and this is someone that everybody knows. It was just someone out of the crowd, but God knew who she was, and she was extraordinary to God, ordinary to the world.
Right. Now, as you mentioned a while ago, Moses.
Yeah.
God says, I want you to go to Pharaoh. He says, me? Who shall I say sent me?
Yeah.
I don't want to go back there. I was there 40 years ago. I know I was educated there. I know all of that, but I'm not your man. I can't even speak, which he could because he was trained in oratory. And if you'll notice that he said, take care and he can speak. And when they get down to the court, guess who does all the speaking? Moses. Mm-hmm. Moses, he does all the speaking.
Yeah, and Mary says, let it be as you say. Let it be so then. So in other words, she is accepting, and God knew that she would be, even though God asks her permission, which is also something that could open up a whole nother conversation. Just all the other things you read about in, let's just say, mythology, where things happen and there's a taking of people or there's a forceful something. God, the creator of the universe, comes and says, here's my plan. I want you to be a part of it, and then asks permission. And then she gives permission and says, well, yes, let it be, as you say. And so he knew she would do that. So she, in that regard, to me, is extraordinary. And favor characterizes strong personal relationships. So God has favor with people. We'll see here in a minute that as we look at some of the scriptures that even as we know an adult, Jesus will read later, favor in the Old Testament was the year of the Lord's favor. This was the Lord looking graciously and lovingly on his people. And so this idea of favor hasn't just popped up because of a human being. It was actually a term and a concept that God used for the whole people group of Israel before. Favor ultimately is a divine quality given to humans as long as they live, according to Psalm 84. People are firmly established, according to Psalm 30, and God grants his favor to help a person endure difficult circumstances. So we might even say, like Joseph was granted God's favor, to be able to be sold by his brothers, go to Egypt, be in prison, be forgotten there by the baker, and God allowed him or equipped him to be able to be mentally well and not damaged by that situation. Whoever has favor of the Lord has great power in prayer, and we see that throughout the whole biblical narrative too. And the Lord can intercede with those people, like Moses had the favor of the Lord, so he interceded with God. Remember the conversation of, these people are your people, and Moses was like, they're not my people, they're your people. And they had that whole conversation about if the Lord wasn't going to go forward with them, then Moses wasn't going either. So there was kind of a stalemate going on, and then God said, okay, I'll continue with them. Moses was able to have that conversation because he was favored by God. God would listen to him and let him rationalize with him that way. But then probably the biggest one is Isaiah 62:1, where Jesus in Nazareth stands up in the synagogue, reads from the scroll, and announces that this is the Lord's favor, and this is the year of the Lord's favor, and he's been anointed as the one who will release the captives and set the prisoners free and do all of these things. And so it's a concept that's bigger than just one person. Right. And so we'll go back to Nazareth here in a bit, but Mary's hometown. Not a lot of people probably know that Mary's hometown is Sepphoris.
Yeah, one tradition is that she came from Sepphoris. Sepphoris is 4 miles away. The last 6 or 7 trips to Israel, we went to Sepphoris. We didn't go before because it wasn't open. In my first 10, 11, 12 trips, it was not open, but then it opened. This was the capital of the north. until Herod Antipas moved it over to Tiberias, built a new capital. Jesus would be a young man growing up. Tradition says, as Stan pointed out, one tradition says that her mother's name was Anne or Anna, and it just dawned on me after we hung up the other day, I guess yesterday,
Right.
that one of the things you can compare what Mary says when she praises God, Hannah.
Mm-hmm.
Hannah is the Old Testament name for Anna or Anne. Interesting.
That is interesting. Which some say is Mary's mother's name.
Yeah. So anyway, one tradition has that's Mary's mother, and they came from Sepphoris, and their father was named Joachim. We don't know if that's the fact or not. Later on, we're gonna get into the genealogies of Luke and Matthew, and again, it talks about and goes back to parents and all of that. So we'll say more about it. But Sepphoris was an extremely important town. Joseph is said to be a carpenter. Jesus is said to be a carpenter. Follow him. It made sense. That's what happened in ancient times. But there wasn't enough work in little bitty Nazareth for you to do much. And the word we translate carpenter really means more than carpenter.
Like a mason.
Yeah, like a mason. It means you worked with wood, you worked with stone, you were more in the construction business. It's really you were a contractor.
Yeah.
And anyway, there's a book by a friend of mine who was a couple of years ahead of me at Lipscomb and went on to teach at Rhodes College at Memphis. He got his doctorate in Bible at Vanderbilt, and he wrote a book. He excavated at Sepphoris, and he wrote a book saying Jesus and the Forgotten City, and it's all about Sepphoris, all about Sepphoris. So he says in his book, and I think it's right, this is where Jesus and Joseph would have worked. Most of the work would have been in the city of Sepphoris there. Sepphoris is just 4 miles away. When you're in Bethlehem, and if somebody will point it out to you, you can see over on another hill.
Nazareth, right?
Yeah. If you're in what did I say, Bethlehem?
You said Bethlehem.
You have good eyesight.
I was just going to point out that Nazareth and Sepphoris, they're on the map, are right across from each other. So.
Yeah, that's called, and what I did is called a mistake. Anyway, if you're in Bethlehem, you can't see any of that. But if you're in Nazareth and you look northwest, you will see the city of Sepphoris, which just gets bigger every time we go, bigger and bigger. So we're going to show you a little bit about it.
Yeah, and we've got some interesting connections coming for those who paid attention last week. Because as I was putting this, we got on the phone yesterday and kind of did round one. Okay, let's separate. You go do your stuff, I'll go do mine. We'll come back together. And while I was off doing some of the stuff that we discussed on Sepphoris, I found some of the history of it, which are some of those Caesars that we talked about last week, who that was a very important city for them, which makes me think maybe that's where some of the animosity came from, that can anything good come from Nazareth? I mean, Nazareth is, but Sepphoris was the city that got all the attention, and that was the one that kept getting rebuilt. And so we're going to look at that here in a minute. So Mary's hometown is what we're just going to call it. Like we said, it doesn't have to be dogmatic about that, but we think that's pretty accurate. During the winter of 39-38 BC, Herod the Great took Sepphoris during a snowstorm immediately after Antigonus abandoned it. That's according to Josephus. Herod retained the city as his northern headquarters for the remainder of his reign. So that's Herod the Great leading up from last week. That's the Herod that we said puts out the edict to kill the baby boys when Jesus is born. So that makes a lot of sense that he's here and Sepphoris is in that discussion, and Mary comes from Sepphoris. It just makes a lot of sense that there's some synergy around all of those things. Judah, the son of Hezekiah, led the Sephardians in a revolt immediately upon the death of Herod the Great in BC 4 or 4 BC, which also makes sense because the family has to retreat to Egypt. And then the angel tells Joseph, okay, you can go back now because he's deceased. And we think, I believe, that Jesus was born around BC 3. And so therefore BC 4 makes a lot of sense that then Herod has died and they come back from Egypt. But then it gets even more interesting. The Roman governor of Syria, Varus, responded swiftly, and he dispatched to Sepphoris a portion of his legions and auxiliary troops under his son and under Caius, a friend, and they sacked Sepphoris and reduced the city to ashes and sold its inhabitants as slaves, again, according to Josephus. So now we've got this. Sepphoris was a great place. King Herod the Great dies. It gets sacked. So now it's destroyed. Meanwhile, Jesus is getting older and learning the trade of his father. And then it says Herod Antipas comes along, and he inherited it, and he wants to go and rebuild it. So Antipas immediately set work to rebuild Sepphoris, and we know that Antipas is who is during Jesus' earthly ministry that we looked at last week. So that would make sense that if Joseph and Jesus go over to the city on the hill across from Nazareth and do construction work, they're working because that lines up with when Herod Antipas wanted to rebuild Sepphoris.
Yeah, Herod Antipas is going to be the builder of two capitals in the north. He's going to rebuild Sepphoris and turn it into a Greek city.
Yeah, the capital of Galilee.
The capital of Galilee, and that he is also king of Perea. So anyway, then later, about AD 20, he will move the capital when Jesus is a young man. He'll move the capital over to the Sea of Galilee and build another city and name it after the emperor at that time, who was Tiberius Caesar. So he names it. That's why the city is called Tiberias.
I mean, look at the excitement. You guys you're like, what? That's why we learned all that stuff last week, so that we could tie it into this week and see how it is kind of there on the margins of the story. Once you see this stuff, it kind of fills in the backstory of what's going on during this time.
Jesus would know Herod Antipas really well and says some sharp things about him. And at his trial, Herod Antipas comes down to his trial for a short little questioning.
Mm-hmm. So walk us through some of this. Is pictures from Sepphoris, right?
Yeah, this is the amphitheater there that is what's left. It just, as every time we went, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. It goes for miles. And this was the main Roman street that has been one of the problems with Tiberias. It went through several earthquakes. And when Henry Austin Layard was excavated, we've talked about his excavations and discovery of Nineveh, so on and so forth. Before he went over to Assyria, he actually went to Israel. It was chaotic there in Jerusalem, and went on down to Petra. It was just a newly discovered place, and then risked his life several times and came back, and he got robbed just outside of Tiberias, and this Jew found him, and he had lost everything but he had one coin in the rags he had on, and this Jew took him into Tiberias, but it was a destroyed city. So that happened a lot to Tiberias, be involved in earthquakes. So the road is no longer quite flat, but at one time it was quite an expensive runway.
So we ought to add this. Thought this was interesting, and you guys would want to know. However, with all that we've presented, Sepphoris is not mentioned in the Bible.
Right.
And so if you're rifling through pages right now trying to find it, you won't. However, we believe, I can say that, I'm going to loop you in. We believe that when Jesus is at the Sermon on the Mount and talks about being the salt and the light and that a city on a hill cannot be hidden, we think he's referring to Sepphoris, because Sepphoris would have been across from Nazareth. It was where all this construction and all this rebuilding was going on, and it would be very conspicuous. And so that was his metaphor or his illustration that he used when he was given that sermon.
Yeah, probably Nazareth was such a small little place that it didn't really shed much light, even though the shock to me on my first trip to Israel, and I was 57, and thought I knew a lot about geography in Israel. I really thought I got a few shocks, and one of the biggest shocks was I didn't know that Nazareth was on top of a hill, but it's way up there. It's way up there, as you'll see in just a minute. But it makes sense when you look at, they took Jesus at Nazareth, not happy with him, and they were going to throw him over the hill, off the hill, and he escaped. He just disappeared in their midst. But it suddenly that made sense. But it's on top of a hill.
Which it's also important because since they're so close and they're on top of two different hills,
Right.
you would basically be on the same plane of vision
Right.
looking across at them.
But Sepphoris would have had lots and lots of lights, so you'd been able to see that. And Nazareth had just very few.
So here's another angle of that same shot where you can see the tour buses and things down there at the bottom. And then here was an interesting map where, you know, the synagogue there and the theater and the fortress and just lots of different areas on how big it actually was at one time.
Yeah, we spent a couple hours there, 2 hours, 2.5, and yet you can't see everything there.
So I would imagine this is true for a lot of people in the room. I'm pretty sure it is for you, and it is for me. Cheryl and I did not grow up in the same hometown. She had a hometown, which we ended up moving to, and I had a hometown, which we moved away from. But here, we're suggesting that Sepphoris is the hometown of Mary, and Joseph's hometown would be Nazareth, right?
Yeah, that's makes sense.
And so there's how the two get connected. And you know, there's the identification of Nazareth by Matthew and Luke and Mark. And Luke mentions a synagogue in Nazareth in chapter 4, verse 16, where Jesus spoke as an adult and where his message was not well received, that we just alluded to when he stood up and read from the scroll of Isaiah 61, verse 2. And you mentioned the hill, which we'll look at here in a second. Here's a artistic drawing of what Nazareth might have looked like. Again, not very popular place with the esteem from the rest of the world. They kind of question why anybody would give anybody a second thought of coming from there, which also may be why Joseph is not really, what would I say, a man of prominence in the New Testament. I mean, he's the earthly father of Jesus, and he's a carpenter, but it's not like everybody pours out, oh, it's Joseph. No one really knows him, right?
Yeah, he disappears, so we don't know if he died early. That's the theory. He died early. There was an older man that died early. We just don't know that for a fact.
What's this one? I forgot.
This shot here?
Yeah.
This is a bath there. And keep in mind, when Jesus was born, the city of Nazareth would have been extremely small, but we're talking about Jesus 20, 30, when he's 20, and then when he's 30 years old, and the city had grown somewhat by then. This is like a Roman bath.
Okay.
Where you put the water down below and you're above. Like at Masada. When you go to Masada, we always take you into one of the palaces there, the Western Palace, and you can see very, very clearly. It really stands out. You get to see the bath, the Roman bath.
So then this tells us that even though Nazareth doesn't have a great reputation with some, it's not some dinky little town that didn't have some standard features.
Right.
And this was a building that I know you're...
Yeah, this is a building now. Again, we don't always go to Nazareth. Sometimes it depends on when. There's some days you can't go because it takes you 2 hours to get in. You have to climb the hill. You have to go through lower Nazareth, where the Arabs live, and a lot of Arab Christians, and then you have to go into the upper part, and traffic is just it's just terrible. There is a day, believe it or not, I think it's Wednesday, in which they take off. I think it's from noon on, and it's like in Mexico. And everybody and his brother's dog just takes off for 4 or 5 hours, and you could drive right through. So we happen to hit that, then we get to see it. So we don't always go. But anyway, the last couple of times they had rebuilt this little city there, a little village inside on top of the hill there. I can't remember what the population is now, but it's the largest city in Galilee now. By far the largest city, population-wise, in Galilee. So this is one of the guys there, and he is going to take you around and show you everything, and then so we'll. Of course, in top you can tell that's Arabic, and then the bottom one actually says the village of Nazareth. In Hebrew, village comes first.
Any thoughts on why the oil lamp is the icon?
I'm sorry.
Any thoughts on why the oil lamp is the icon?
Not really.
Okay.
There is sometimes they have those icons for some of the national parks or some special sites, and that's something fairly new.
Okay.
I mean, this was not even there when I first started going. First 8 or 9 trips.
But here's the preface.
Yeah, now you can see how high it is. Now you're on Nazareth looking at the valley when the valleys were low, and you can see when they threw Jesus, going to throw him off the hill, it was going to be a serious fall.
Yeah, if you're familiar, which I'm sure most people in this audience are, with farmland, you know that those are crops out there, and that you're a long way above where they are. And here's another view of where you can tell where the interstate is, or the highway. Maybe it's not an interstate over there, but
it's a 4-laner though.
That's significantly below where these pictures are being taken by the photographer. That's some sort of water treatment or something out there.
Yeah, they actually raise fish. They have these fish ponds, and the 4-lane highway you saw was not there on my first 8 or 10 trips. They didn't build a 4-lane highway. There was one going from Tel Aviv north, and the main reason they built the 4-lane highways was for the military, so to get the tanks and things moving faster. But now there's a lot of 4-lane highways popping up.
So the point is, you got a lot of rocks, you got a lot of elevation. It makes a lot of the story come alive. And I thought The Chosen did a good job with it too, when they take him out to throw him over because they're so irritated that he stood up and read the scroll of Isaiah and said, "This is the year of the Lord's favor, and I'm the one that's anointed to do these things." They wanted him to recant that, said that it was blasphemy. He said no. And then he just said, "We're not doing this today," were his words in The Chosen, and he walked right through the crowd and just went right on up the hill and walked away.
Galilee only gets 24 inches of rain a year. Look how green it is, though. They keep it extremely green. And the mountain in the distance over there, I'm 90% sure it's Mount Tabor.
Yeah, I believe you're right.
Yeah.
So this turns into what you've taught us in here a lot over the years, and that is that anytime there's anything of importance, and we say, well, how do we know that Joseph was from Nazareth? Well, there's a church there of St. Joseph, because anytime they find any place that they think is biblically accurate spot, they build a church on top of it.
Right.
So
Yeah,
I'm sure you've been here.
And there's 2 churches connected with Mary. We show one of them here.
Yeah. And this is inside that building, right?
Right.
Which is just beautiful with all that wood and stone, and it's just very elaborate. Then the Church of the Annunciation, which would be more in line with being connected to Mary than with Joseph.
Yeah, this is, and they feel like one of the 2 churches connected with Mary, there's a spring there. And again, the tradition is this is where the angel Gabriel met her.
Oh yeah, we have a picture of that coming up. And then this is inside that church, right?
Yeah, right.
Just very ornate, has the fresco there on the wall with the painting, with the scenes, and all the columns and the wood. And then tell us about this. This is downstairs, right?
Yeah, go downstairs, and they've got things set up. We're going to show you the well.
More the waiting downstairs to get to where it is.
And that's actually a place they could lecture. You could lecture there.
On the way. And then here's the well with all the coins that are thrown there.
Yeah, people throw coins at all the time.
And so someone says this is where Gabriel showed up to talk to Mary, which is interesting because...
Theory, tradition.
Well, yeah, I mean, but just in contrast to some other artwork this morning in the sermon, the Annunciation there was she was in some little bedroom by herself, and Gabriel showed up, and she was in the bed and pulled the sheets up or whatever, or she was out getting a bucket of water from a well. I mean, we don't know. Is the point? And people have different opinions about where they think he showed up to talk to her, but really, it doesn't probably matter, and we're not really certain. And so last week, I put this in there, and you were like, "Ooh, that's a handsome-looking dude." The head of Augustus. But see, Augustus is the one who actually is the emperor at the time, who actually says to Joseph and Mary, "I'm decreeing that everybody be counted for the census, so you'll need to go back to to Bethlehem, in order to be counted," right? And so that also is interesting, because if you look at the dates here, you have, that was when he was actually emperor, but you would have the time that he gives that decree, which lines up with Luke 2, verse 1, where Mary and Joseph go back to Bethlehem for that reason. So I guess he was that's BC. That works fine. Yeah, 27 through 25 BC, he was
Must be,
the emperor, right?
it must have been born then, because he is emperor till 14.
Till 14.
AD.
Okay.
AD 14.
Okay.
He and Tiberius rule 2 or 3 years together as co-rulers,
Yeah.
and then Tiberius takes over. And
Yeah, so what we're trying to do is, one of the things that we too have a challenge with is that when you have an entire month on Mary, and even though we started this class by saying there's inferences of her in all these other places and whatnot, there's still not a whole lot of material to just look at just Bible verses about Mary and get 5, well, in our case 4 Sundays of lessons. So what we're trying to do is show the connections of some of the archaeology. So we've now gone from Sepphoris, Nazareth, right across from each other, and now we get the connection of why they would be going to Bethlehem, where they came from, who gave that decree that they need to go, and then look at where Bethlehem is. Bethlehem of Judea, because there's 2 Bethlehems, right?
yeah, there's a Bethlehem just a few miles from Nazareth, a little bitty town of Bethlehem up there. So it always will say Bethlehem Ephratah or Bethlehem of Judea, to let you know that this is David's Bethlehem. This is Ruth's Bethlehem.
Yeah, which is exactly what we're getting ready to do here, is that Bethlehem is mentioned in the Old Testament numerous times. It lies on the border of a well-watered and fertile region, and on the dry district of Boaz, which we should have that make us pause and say, wait, we did Ruth in here this year, and Boaz was from Bethlehem, and that's where Ruth went back with Naomi after Ruth's father. His name just slipped my mind. Starts with an E. Elias?
Elimelech, you mean? You thought Ruth's father?
Yeah. He's the one who leaves Bethlehem because of the famine and tries to go somewhere else. Then he dies, then their husbands die, and then they come back, and they come back to Bethlehem, and that's where they're blessed with Boaz being there.
Yeah, we usually pronounce it Elimelech, but it's Elimelech.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. That's why that was stuck in my head. And so we see that connection there, and then we keep going, and we see another place that, or several places that Bethlehem shows up, which we'll look at here in a minute with Samuel. But there's where Bethlehem of Judea is compared to the Mount of Olives, En-Gedi, Hebron. These are these are cities from the Old Testament that we're familiar with their names from the studies that we've done in here.
Yeah, that first map is too far back, I guess, right?
Probably.
If we were looking at the map we had up there with Sepphoris and Nazareth and Bethlehem, I was going to show you. I forgot to when we were there.
All right, hang on. I'll just go back. We'll get back there. We've got a couple.
I'll show you a trick I learned from an old East Indian. Little humor there. Apparently very loud.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. When you're trying to decide how far a place is,
It's not on there.
from the Sea of Galilee, the bottom of it, to the Dead Sea is 65 miles as the crow flies. Now, if you on a boat and go down the Jordan, it's 115 miles. The Jordan wanders around, but as the crow flies, it's 65 miles. So you can see Nazareth to Bethlehem will be maybe 70 miles. So Bethlehem is just a little for the. You see that?
Yeah, we got to go back to the map that has Bethlehem on it, because that one just has Jerusalem. But don't anybody? Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
And Jerusalem, ironically, is not on this one. But yeah, it's at the top. Basically, it's right there at the top of the Dead Sea, so it still fits your 65 miles.
Yeah, they put Mount of Olives on there, but they put Jerusalem.
Right. Well, you have to keep zooming in, and this is also the patriarchal period,
Right.
which I selected, so they didn't have all of the other.
So at least gives you an idea of the distance they had to travel.
And I know you've shown us this scene before. This is coming into Bethlehem in modern day, right?
Right, yeah.
And the little church is still there. That
Yeah. And Bethlehem is, a crowded place now.
So now at that very moment, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters, and he brings a blessing from Yahweh to Ruth, who's there gathering behind the other women. And so we see that about Bethlehem. And then over in 1 Samuel, this is the one that probably really starts to narrow in what we're trying to drive at here this morning. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long do you intend to mourn for Saul?" Because remember, Saul has gone away from Yahweh, gone to the medium of Endor for information, and God said, okay, I'm separating myself from him. And he's chosen another one to be anointed by Samuel. And when he says this, he says, I've rejected Saul as king over Israel. Fill your horn with olive oil and go. I'm sending you to Jesse in Bethlehem, for I have selected a king for myself from among his sons. Which, of course, we know who that is. The next slide tells us that David was the son of Jesse from Bethlehem in Judea. So we now are getting the connections of the house of David, the city of David, and also Jesus being born in that city, and salvation coming from that city, just like the blessing came from that city through Boaz to Ruth, which continued the line to Jesus. And then we've talked in here a little bit about the Hebrew behind Bethlehem, which is really, it's Beit Lechem, Beit meaning house, and Lechem meaning bread. So it's the house of bread, and Jesus is the bread of life. So you just end up getting in this awe type situation when you make all these connections. And so then I found Micah 5:2. Now help me out here. This is still the right Bethlehem, right?
It's what?
It's still the correct Bethlehem.
Yes.
Even though it doesn't say Judea, it actually says Ephratah, right?
Yeah, that is probably a clan.
Okay.
With Bethlehem is usually with that term, it's always this Judah Bethlehem, which is Bethlehem could be in Galilee.
Okay.
The other Bethlehem is only mentioned a couple of times.
Well, Micah tells us just point blank that this seemingly insignificant little town will be where the king will emerge, who will rule over Israel on the Lord's behalf, and whose origins are in the distant past, which we're showing you how far back distantly it actually goes. You can get Bethlehem all the way back to the story of Abraham.
Okay. I think we got a couple of minutes. I can talk about the two genealogies of Luke and Matthew.
Sure, we have exactly two. You have a minute for each one.
Oh, okay. Luke is giving you Mary's genealogy, and Matthew's giving you the kingly genealogy and the male side, but through the kings. Both of them started David, and then they deviate. We look at them. Suddenly, Luke goes to Nathan, who is the son of David. If you remember, they named one of their child of Bathsheba Nathan, which showed they showed no animosity toward the prophet Nathan, or wouldn't have done that. And it's through that child that Mary's bloodline comes. The other bloodline, the other is the kingly line. It's David, Solomon, and then it goes to the kings, and then they merge together. And so when it says in Luke's genealogy, it talks about as opposed the son of Joseph. Then in Matthew's it calls Joseph the son of a guy named Jacob. In Luke it calls it's the son of Heli. Well, the word son can mean son, son-in-law, descendant, and the males were the ones followed, and oftentimes it would be that this was his father-in-law. So some say, oh, the father-in-law of Mary then would not have been the guy from Sepphoris. Well, it could have been, because this could be a grandfather, could be a lot of things. There's really no conflict there. We just don't know all the little details. But anyway, you have two genealogies that merge into Jesus. One kingly, and Joseph's the other. I mean, the kingly genealogy from David. The other is Mary's genealogy.
Yeah, and your point's well taken because Scripture proves it, that they call Jesus son of David, and so that he's not, but he is.
Right.
He is by several generations further down, but they're not going to sit there and say how many greats they have to put in front of it to be the great grandson of David.
Right.
So I thought we would live this week with John's question from his sermon, what happens when you say yes to God? Because we're going to be, obviously, as you can tell, now that we've gotten to Bethlehem, we're going to be walking into the story of where Jesus will come on the scene, and when Mary actually has that conversation with Gabriel and does say yes. And that leads us to our prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Yahweh, we pray for faith like Mary's, allowing us to believe that nothing will be impossible with God. May we say, here am I, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Have a blessed day. See you next week.